What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of Primetime Sports Podcast, hosted by Joey Maylari. So in today's episode, I'm going to break down the surprising Jaylen Brown trade that went down this week. Jaylen Brown was traded in a blockbuster deal to the Philadelphia 76ers. In this deal, the 76ers received forward Jaylen Brown in exchange for Paul George, a 2028 first-round pick, a 2031 unprotected first-round pick from Philadelphia, a 2028 second-round pick, and a 2030 second-round pick. So the Celtics in this deal, all in all, get Paul George, 2 first-round picks, and 2 second-round picks. Here are my thoughts. I think Jaylen Brown, at the end of the day, is a tremendous basketball player. I just felt like when you put Jaylen Brown on the trade block multiple years in a row, one year it being for Anthony Davis, Kevin Durant, Damian Lillard, most recently Giannis Antetokounmpo, I felt like the Celtics were at a crossroads where, at that point, once you're putting them in more trade talks, and it seems like they were very close to getting Giannis, it only made sense in my eyes that that was the end of Jaylen Brown's time in Boston. And I look at this trade package now, and I think the Celtics wanted Jaylen Brown gone no matter the price or the return. I have a hard time believing that no team would offer a young rising player in exchange for Jaylen Brown. But I guess there is a chance not many teams want to budge. That obviously happens. Not every team is willing to give up a young star. I think teams knew the Celtics wanted Jaylen Brown gone, and that ended up hurting his trade value. Also, Jaylen Brown on his Twitch stream earlier this offseason saying that this past season was his favorite year. That probably didn't help his trade value much either. After the Celtics missed out on Giannis, they had no option but to find a new home for JB. You can't shop him every summer and expect him to be back and happy as a Celtic. The Celtics should have looked to get a younger player in return than Paul George, and they probably would have been able to get a young player if they waited out free agency a little bit longer to see what team missed out on a potential free agent or a potential trade. And maybe the Celtics' goal was to get the 2 ones they got in this trade and then take those 2 ones and ship them for another player. This return tells me, though, that the Celtics were desperate to get rid of JB, and also that other teams in the league did not value Jaylen Brown as an MVP candidate as much as JB himself and fans did. All in all, I think the Celtics were motivated to just get rid of Jaylen Brown as soon as possible rather than wait things out and see what team didn't land a big star via trade or free agency. The Celtics probably would have had a better offer and more offers down the line, but who knows at the end of the day, maybe this was the best offer the Celtics received. But that's hard for me to believe, especially considering that the Sixers would have had to attach a first-round pick to Paul George's contract in order to move it anywhere, which is why landing JB for Paul George is a big win for the Sixers, and it's worth the roll of the dice for Philly because Jaylen Brown is a terrific basketball player, and he's only 29 years old. He should have netted a young player in return to build around, but other teams and other GMs must not have valued JB as high as JB himself and to the level that Celtics fans viewed him as well. With that being said, Bobby Marks of ESPN was saying that NBA trades are all circumstantial, which is definitely the truth because every player is traded for different returns depending on the circumstances of both teams financially in the deal, which team's in a win-now mode and which team's in a rebuild mode, and then how much draft capital each team has on each side. But I see this trade package, and I think the Celtics were more motivated to get rid of Jaylen Brown as soon as possible rather than try to get the best return. I will say this, though. I know Paul George is 36 years old, and I know he missed 35 games last year due to suspension, but he's still a bucket and showcased his ability to still play at a high level in games 5 through 7 in the Celtics Sixers series from the first round. He shot 55% from 3 in that series off 6 attempts per game from 3, along with 17 points per game and 1.8 stocks. He's not a 40-year-old Vince Carter like people are saying. Paul George finished the 2026 playoffs shooting 35 of 71 from 3, which is a 49% percentage from three-point land. And he was 16 points per game, 4 rebounds, 3 assists per game. So he's a lot better of a player than people are giving him credit for. I know he's 36. I know his best days are behind him, but he's still a good player. And I would take Paul George's defense, even at 36 years old, over Jaylen Brown's defense. And I know he's 36, and people will say, well, the best days of his career behind him, and that's probably the case. But you also never know. People said the same thing about Kawhi Leonard, and that Kawhi Leonard, at 34 years old, just had the best year of his career. So maybe Paul George can surprise some people and ball out this upcoming season. I still have faith in Paul George. I still think he could be a top 35 to 40 player in the game. That's if he's fully healthy and playing to his best of his abilities. Even if his $54 million salary is not warranted the last few years, and I know that's a hefty contract, he's still a very good player. And I think he's going to fit well in the Celtics lineup because he can play off the ball. He's a very good defender. He's a better playmaker and passer than Jaylen Brown. And he's going to turn the ball over less. Also add in, he's a better three-point shooter than Jaylen Brown. But I do know, and I acknowledge, Jaylen Brown's only 29 years old. Was a homegrown player, won a Finals MVP in Boston, brought back a title in 2024, has been an All-NBA selection, has been, I believe, a 5-time All-Star, and he's also coming off a career year, and he's a better scorer at this stage of his career than Paul George. So I understand why Celtics fans are upset with this trade. You're trading a player that's a homegrown player who just came off a season where he was in the MVP race, had a career year at 29 years old, and they also didn't get as good of a return as fans wanted. But I think, honestly, at the end of the day, Paul George, as I said, I think he's going to fit well in this lineup. I really do. I think he's going to surprise some people and have a bounce back year. I understand why Celtics fans are upset because they didn't really receive a young star in return here. But I think Brad Stevens made this move with another move in mind down the line. I do think there's more to this decision than just advanced metrics, which some people are pointing to. I think ultimately it comes down to ownership not wanting to pay Jaylen Brown the mega extension that he's eligible for this summer. Jaylen Brown's eligible for a 2-year, $145 million extension this summer, with already 3 years left on his deal as well. So it'd basically be 5 years left under contract at big-time money. So that's why I think the Celtics made this move. And at the end of the day, I think these draft picks are more valuable than people say. The 2028 first-round pick, there's a lot of stipulations to it, so no one really knows what's going to happen, if it's conveyed one way or another, whether it's going to Philly, the Clippers, or the Celtics, because I believe this is the 2028 first-round pick from the Clippers that came from the James Harden trade that Philadelphia owns. And I'm not really sure how this pick's going to be conveyed, whether it goes from the Celtics or the Sixers keep it. There are some stipulations to it that are still probably not too clear online. But either way, that could be a valuable pick. And then in that 2031 unprotected first-round pick, that might be valuable as well. In 2031, Joel Embiid's going to be 36 years old. Jaylen Brown's going to be 34. Tyrese Maxey's going to be 30. And the Sixers will likely be in cap trouble at that point as well, since none of those three guys that I just mentioned are signed through the 2030-2031 season. And they're likely going to have heavy extensions paid out to them before then to keep them. So this 2031 first-round pick is valuable, in my opinion. And I understand why the Sixers are doing this. They're going all in right now to try to make a run in the East, an Eastern Conference that has loaded up over the last week. You've seen Giannis go from Milwaukee to Miami. Kawhi Leonard go from LA to Toronto. Jaylen Brown go from Boston to Philly. So there's been a lot of movement in the Eastern Conference over the last week. And this Sixers lineup is really talented. Tyrese Maxey at point guard, VJ Edgecombe, who I'm very high on at shooting guard, Jaylen Brown at small forward, Dean Wade at power forward, who they just recently signed, and Joel Embiid at center. This lineup is a great lineup talent-wise. I do think they could upgrade a power forward, and that could be the place that they put LeBron James if they were to sign him in free agency. Dean Wade is a very good stretch big. He can space the floor because he can shoot threes and can also switch defensively, which helps. But I do think they could upgrade a power forward, and if they could land LeBron James, that would be a great get. I do think Dean Wade is a good player. I don't think I would want him as my starting power forward on a team trying to win a championship. I know he started about half the season this past year for the Cleveland Cavaliers. He's a good player, but I think if you could upgrade there and get LeBron James, that would be a major get there for Philadelphia. If Jaylen Brown wants to be the first option in the 1A on a team, Philadelphia is not the best place for that, since they already have Tyrese Maxey as the number one option. Joel Embiid's still going to be the number 2 option when healthy. And I think Jaylen Brown will probably be the third option a decent amount of time on this team. There will be nights, obviously, there'll be injuries and off nights for some guys where Jaylen Brown will be the first option. But I do think number 1 option when things are optimal and people are healthy, it's going to be Tyrese Maxey. And this team's talented. I'm not saying they aren't, but I don't see them as the best team in the East. I don't think Jaylen Brown is the best fit next to Tyrese Maxey and Joel Embiid, to be honest. But we're going to see how things play out. There's only one basketball at the end of the day. But Tyrese Maxey and Jaylen Brown have been great at getting to the bucket and scoring. They were both top 5 this past season in points off drives in the NBA. So they both can score and slash, and that's what you need in today's NBA. So they could be really fun to watch. This team has a ton of athleticism. Edgecombe, Brown, Maxey. They're going to be fun to watch, but I don't think this team's the best team in the East. I still think there are better teams. And at the end of the day, we're going to have to see how things play out here. But as I said, I don't think he will be the best fit next to Maxey and Embiid. With those two guys being probably the primary options, Jaylen Brown's going to be a little bit more off the ball than he was in Boston. He's going to have to look to play make a little more when the ball hits his hands. And I know he's a score-first player, and at the end of the day, that's why he had a career year this past year. He's a terrific scorer. But when you're next to Joel Embiid and Tyrese Maxey, they're going to be looking for the ball as well. So Jaylen Brown's going to have to play make a little more now in Philly than he did in Boston. But this team's definitely talented. I'm excited to see what they can do. But there were financial circumstances of why this trade went down. You look at Paul George's contract, he has 2 years left on his deal. $54.1 million for the upcoming season. And then in the 2027-2028 season, he has a $56.6 million player option that presumed he's going to pick up. So he's owed around $114 million over the last 2 seasons on his current deal. As for Jaylen Brown, he's making $57 million this upcoming season, making $61 million in the 2027-2028 season, and then $64.9 million in the 2028-2029 season. So all in all, he has 3 years remaining on his current deal with around $185 million on the books. But the Celtics would have likely had to have given him a 2-year, $145 million extension this summer. And with that extension, the Celtics would have had to likely sign Jaylen Brown to keep him happy. It would have been overall, if you add those 2 years on at $145 million, it would have been 5 years, $330 total million on his deal with the original 3 years and now this 2-year extension. So that would be around $66 million he'd be making on average per season. So the Celtics, by trading him, theoretically are saving $216 million. If they were to have given him that $145 million extension, they'd be saving $216 million by having Paul George. And Paul George is probably going to pick up his player option next summer. So he's still owed, as I said, around $114 million. But at the end of the day, this new ownership comes from a private equity background, which the main goal of private equity is to maximize revenue with the resources you have while keeping in mind the costs you have and looking for ways to cut those costs so that your net revenue and net gain is at its highest. So that's why I think here there's a lot of financial circumstances and reasoning for why the Celtics didn't give Jaylen Brown that 2-year extension, and also why they wanted to trade him as soon as they did. This deal gives the Celtics some financial flexibility, and also 2 first-round picks that could end up being premium first-round picks, which I think the Celtics are now going to take those and flip those with maybe one of their own first-round picks. The Celtics still have some future first-round picks to work with, and maybe they'll move Derek White as well, which I don't think Celtics fans would want that. But I think if you take these 2 first-round picks in this deal, add in a Celtics first-round pick in the future and Derek White, you could go out and get Trey Murphy III and maybe Zion Williamson or DeJounte Murray from New Orleans. I don't know if that's the best deal, and I don't know if that is what the Celtics are going to do. But I would say half of that deal that I just said, I think the Celtics should do. I would take those 2 first-round picks, and I would go out and get Trey Murphy III because he's a terrific basketball player, and it fit well in the Celtics system next to Paul George, Derek White, and Jayson Tatum. With the current CBA, teams have to make a decision on who to pay max contracts to and how much money they want to go above the salary cap. And do they want to do that in multiple seasons? Do they want to go above the luxury tax? Do they want to be above the first apron or the second apron? So at the end of the day, this CBA definitely makes things a little bit tougher for teams. And that's why you see teams trading guys early. LaMelo Ball just got traded by Charlotte. He was extension eligible at some point soon. Charlotte probably didn't want to pay him that, and they didn't want to even have to deal with those negotiations, so they traded him early to Minnesota. And it seems like in this situation here, the Celtics did not want to pay Jaylen Brown $70+ million per season in his age 34 and age 35 seasons. And it's presumed that the Sixers are likely going to be a second apron team down the line and be a repeater in the luxury tax when they have to give Jaylen Brown an extension and pay VJ Edgecombe down the line as well. And who knows what the future of Tyrese Maxey is money-wise as well. He's a great player, and they're going to have to pay him whatever he wants when he's extension eligible down the line again as well. And I think ultimately when the Celtics missed out on Giannis, the Celtics pivoted and said, you know what, we're just going to take whatever the best deal is left on the table and move Jaylen Brown as soon as they can. And there were financial implications of why they missed out on Giannis as well. Supposedly, and this is reported by Bill Simmons, Giannis was about to sign off on the Celtics trade, but he wanted a 3-year extension at 35% of the cap, and the Celtics were only set on 2 years of an extension at 30% of the cap. So 1 year of a difference, and also 5% of a difference of how much he would get of the total cap. So at the end of the day, once they missed out on Giannis, I think they just pivoted and said, you know what, Jaylen Brown, we are trading, and even if we missed out on Giannis, we're moving him. I don't even think they even contemplated still bringing him back. And I could be wrong, but that's just what it seems like from the outside. And I would also say this. Jaylen Brown and Jayson Tatum obviously had a lot of success together ultimately, got a ring in 2024. So no matter what, this era is always going to be success looking back. When you get that ring, it's a big-time get. But there is a question of whether or not they could have won more together. And I would say a lot of people would agree they probably could have, whether they could have beaten Golden State in the past in 2022 or maybe won another ring in the future. But I do think there was a divide between Jaylen Brown and Jayson Tatum. I've said it for a while. I don't think Jayson Tatum and Jaylen Brown were ever closest friends. They were always playing in each other's shadows, which is why I've always said that they tolerated one another, but were not close friends and didn't like one another as much as they may have said they have. That's just my opinion, though. I could be completely wrong. But it is pretty interesting that this past year was Jaylen Brown's favorite year of his career, which is something he said on his Twitch after this past season ended for the Celtics. And it's interesting because they won 56 games in a year where Jayson Tatum missed most of the season, and they ended up losing a 3-1 lead in the first round of the playoffs to Philly. And somehow that ended up being Jaylen Brown's favorite year of his career. And I understand this was the best year he had statistically in his career, was in the MVP race. But I think the Celtics front office and ownership didn't like that line, since I think there's a lot behind it when it comes to Jayson Tatum being out, and that's why it may have been Jaylen Brown's favorite career, because he was the 1A option, and he was the guy in the alpha in Boston that got them to the playoffs. And now, Jayson Tatum presumably being fully healthy heading into next year, there was a question mark of whether or not Jaylen Brown could go back to being the second option to Jayson Tatum. And I think that was a worry for the team having to deal with that next season. And the coaching staff as well. I think that was a worry for both of them. But I do think this move was made with Jayson Tatum's approval. I don't think the Celtics make this move if it upset Jayson Tatum. Jayson Tatum could have gotten the way of this move, I believe. And had he not wanted to happen, he could have said to Brad Stevens and Joe Mazzulla, hey, I don't want this trade happening. I want Jaylen Brown to stay here. So at the end of the day, with this trade going down, Tatum must have been fine with the Celtics moving Brown. I could be completely wrong, and maybe he's completely out of touch with what the front office does. But no matter what the future holds, the Celtics did get a ring out of the Tatum and Brown era, even though they likely could have potentially won more together at some point, whether that was in 2022 against Golden State or another one down the line in the future. They probably could have won another ring together. And that's coming from someone that said 5 years ago, back in 2021 and 2022, that I never thought Tatum and Brown would win a ring together. I said that when I was at BC on sports radio my junior year, which was the 2021-2022 season. Same year they ended up going to the NBA Finals. I said I don't think they'd ever win a ring together. And at the end of the day, I was proven wrong. They found a way to do so, and they'll always be in the record books for that. They'll always be Celtics legends because of that ring. But I do think there's also an analytical background to why this trade went down. After the trade went down, a ton of reports came out that alleged that analytics caused the Celtics to see Jaylen Brown as expendable. And analytics were also the reason that other teams are not as willing to send a hefty trade package for JB. On Twitter, there were multiple advanced metrics that people pointed to say that Jaylen Brown was not as valuable to the Celtics winning. And I'm going to relay some of those numbers now. And I'm not saying analytics are the end-all be-all, so take these statistics as you will. You could be agreeing with them or disagree with them. That's absolutely fine, but I just want to point them out. In the last 6 seasons, so from the 2020-2021 season to the 2025-2026 season, the Celtics were 60-26, 60 wins, 26 losses, without Jaylen Brown in the lineup, which is a 700 win percentage. With Jaylen Brown in the lineup, they were 263 and 131, a 670 win percentage. In the 10 years JB was a Celtic, the Celtics were 440 and 234 with him in the lineup, which is a 653 win percentage, and then 90-36 without him in the lineup, which is a 714 win percentage, including a 36-6 record at 857 win percentage over the last 3 years without Jaylen Brown in the lineup. But I do think that statistic is a little misleading because in the 2023-2024 season, the Celtics were 12-0 without Jaylen Brown that season, but they also had Derek White, Jayson Tatum, Kristaps Porzingis, Andrew Holiday that season, all getting quality minutes. And for a lot of that second half of that year that the Celtics won the NBA Finals, in that regular season, they were sitting guys every other night. There would be a night Jayson Tatum sat, a night Jaylen Brown would sit, a night Horford would sit, a night Drew Holiday would sit, a week Kristaps Porzingis would sit. They alternated who would sit in a lot of those games. So I do think those statistics with and without Jaylen Brown can be a little misleading, in my opinion. And I don't think they should hold as much weight as some people say, but I understand when some people point to that the Celtics did have a good record with Brown and without Brown. A lot of the time, they probably had Jayson Tatum playing, which helps. It also, at one point, like I mentioned, had Porzingis, Andrew Holiday, who were two great complementary pieces to Jayson Tatum and Jaylen Brown. Probably the best two additions the Celtics could have ever had in that 2023 summer, and that's a big reason they won the NBA Finals in 2024. I'm not sure how these advanced metrics compare to Paul George's, but I think the Celtics see Paul George as less turnover prone and a better three-point shooter than Jaylen Brown, which that's why I think they think he could be a good complementary piece next to Jayson Tatum. Is he the same player at this stage of his career as Jaylen Brown? No. But I do think Brown's absence will leave Tatum with some more possessions with the ball in his hands, and that's going to lead the Celtics to have probably a few more three-point makes than Jaylen Brown would provide, because Jaylen Brown was a lot more keen on shooting mid-range jump shots and getting to the bucket over the last year. And he also turned the ball over a few more times than Paul George is probably going to. So that's why the Celtics are probably going to have some more possessions and getting a few more shot attempts than not, because Jaylen Brown did turn the ball over more than Tatum is probably going to as the 1A next season. Here's another statistic. Jaylen Brown was third in the NBA last year in turnovers per possession, and he also had a 57% true shooting percentage, which is right around the league average, which is why his on-off numbers are not as great. And I know a lot of people pointing to the on-off numbers as to why the Celtics made this trade. And the on-off numbers are what they are because of the high turnover rate and also the true shooting percentage being around league average. And that's also why the Celtics' point differential also was a little bit worse with Jaylen Brown on the floor over the last 4 years. And I'm just going to name these, like I mentioned, take these statistics as you will. But in the 2022-2023 season, the Celtics had a minus 3.9 point differential with Jaylen Brown on the floor, a minus 7.2 in 2023-2024 season. In the 2024-2025 season, they had a minus 0.5, and then had a minus 0.46 in the 2025-2026 season, which these negatives are basically saying that the Celtics have a lower average scoring margin in every 100 possessions with Jaylen Brown on the floor versus Jaylen Brown being off of the floor. But that may be because of his high turnover rate and his around average true shooting percentage. But here's another stat that people pointed to, and that's net rating. In 2026, with Jaylen Brown on the floor, the Celtics had a plus 6.7 net rating and had a plus 12.9 net rating without him. And that's basically just taking the difference between offensive rating and defensive rating. And that's basically subtracting defensive rating, which is points allowed per 100 possessions, from a team's offensive rating, which is points scored per 100 possessions. And then from 2020 to 2026, with Jaylen Brown and Jayson Tatum both on the floor, the Celtics had a plus 8.2 net rating. And then with just Jayson Tatum, they had a plus 10.1 net rating. And then with just Jaylen Brown on the floor, they had a plus 4.2 net rating. So I think the Celtics may have looked at some of these numbers and said, Jaylen Brown is not as valuable as Jayson Tatum. And that's why they ultimately chose to keep Jayson Tatum, which, according to Shams Charania, there were teams interested in trading for Jaylen Brown and Jayson Tatum over the last few weeks. Jaylen Brown was available. Jayson Tatum was not. And there was another stat that I want to mention that somebody pointed out. Among active 5-time NBA All-Stars, besides DeMar DeRozan, Jaylen Brown is the only one with a negative career on-off. Jaylen Brown has a career minus 1.3 on-off, which may be the reason the Celtics front office was willing to trade him, because they were looking at some of those numbers with him in the lineup, with him out of the lineup, with him on the floor, with him off the floor. And there's a few more stats I want to mention. One coming from a Twitter account, Data Baller. Jaylen Brown had a 10.3% scoring turnover rate, which was among the highest of high-usage scorers in the NBA. For that statistic, the lower percentage, the better. I will note, Giannis had a scoring turnover rate around 10 this past year. So at the end of the day, to give Jaylen Brown some leeway there, Giannis also had a high scoring turnover rate from this past season. I know he battled injuries and didn't play the whole year, and the Milwaukee Bucks were tanking as well, it seemed. But I did want to point that out. Jaylen Brown also had 36 shots per 100 possessions and only generated 13 potential assists per 100 shots. And Data Baller also pointed out that he's 3 times as likely to shoot as he is to pass and have a potential assist. And to compare that number there that I mentioned, the 36 shots to 13 assists per 100 possessions, SGA was at 34 shots to 18 potential assists, which is more balanced between shot attempts and potential assists. But I will say this, I know analytics should not be the end-all be-all, and I know people get very passionate about why analytics are killing sports, but at the end of the day, I think some of these numbers may exhibit why some other teams may have reportedly saw Jaylen Brown as a negative player. Maybe they didn't want to give up as many assets because of some of these numbers. And I'm only just reporting these based on some of the numbers I found online. I didn't do too much research on my own, but I think these advanced metrics may have been the reason the Celtics were willing to trade Jaylen Brown. Besides just the financial implications of an extension and owing Jaylen Brown around $70 million per season on that extension. But I do think Paul George is still a good player, and I've told a lot of my friends that are Celtics fans that at the end of the day, the Celtics should have got a young star in return for Jaylen Brown. I do still believe they could have gotten that if they waited things out, but I do think they felt forced to move him as soon as possible for some reason. Maybe it was ownership saying, hey, just get rid of him, get whatever you can in return, and then we'll flip those 2 picks maybe for another player down the line. And that brings me to my next question. Is there another move coming from the Celtics? I think the Celtics could flip those 2 first-round picks, which one of those could end up being the Clippers' first-round pick in 2028. That could have some value if the Clippers are struggling at that point 2 years down the line. And then also that 2031 unprotected first-round pick from Philly, they could move both of those to get Trey Murphy III. And the Celtics could trade for Murphy without even trading a player because they have a trade exception. And I do think a starting lineup of Derek White, Paul George, Trey Murphy III, Jayson Tatum, and Mitchell Robinson, or Neemias Queta, whoever's starting there at the center position, is a better starting lineup than Peyton Pritchard, Derek White, Jaylen Brown, Jayson Tatum, and Mitchell Robinson. I could be wrong at the end of the day, but I do think Paul George has more value and is still a good player. He's not the player he once was in that 2018-2019 season when he was an MVP candidate and was top 3 and was a terrific player for Oklahoma City. His best days are probably behind him, but he's still a good basketball player. And at the end of the day, he offers the Celtics some financial flexibility that Jaylen Brown probably wouldn't have, because Jaylen Brown would have probably gotten that 2-year extension from the Celtics to keep him happy, and that would have left him on the books of 5 years. Even if Paul George picks up the option that he has next summer, which is a player option in his contract, he's only on the books for 2 more seasons, this upcoming season and 1 more. And I think the Celtics liked having that financial flexibility. Right now, the Celtics have 8 first-round picks and 7 second-round picks they can move. So 8 ones and 7 twos that they could potentially trade to try to make this team better right now. And I know a lot of Celtics fans are upset because Jaylen Brown didn't get traded for as high of a price as they wanted him to be traded for. You look at Walker Kessler, Utah traded him in a sign and trade with the LA Lakers, and they got 2 first-round picks and 2 swaps, that are first-round pick swaps, added on top of those unprotected first-round picks from the Lakers. So the Lakers traded 2 ones and 2 first-round pick swaps in exchange for Walker Kessler. And I think that's why Celtics fans are upset, because the Celtics didn't get a young star in return. I still think they should have tried to get Shaedon Sharpe from Portland. Maybe Portland didn't want to trade him. And when you're talking to Philly, they tried for VJ Edgecombe. Philly said no. I would have went to LeBaron Philon Jr. and said, you know what? Let me get him in this trade. I think you should have gotten some young star to try to build around, or at least try to develop. But ultimately, I'm not sure what happened here. I think the Celtics have a lot of things they're probably going to answer on Monday when they have their press conference with Brad Stevens. There's obviously a lot of answers that fans want. I don't think this trade is as bad as a lot of people are trying to make it seem. With that being said, I do acknowledge the Celtics probably should have gotten, as I said, a young star in return or a young rising player in return for Jaylen Brown, especially when he's 29 years old. And I know Paul George is 36 and he's injury prone. But he showcased in the playoffs that he can still be a great shooter, shooting around 49% from 3 this past playoffs for Philadelphia. So he's still a good player, Paul George. And he's going to probably have less turnovers than Jaylen Brown. Granted, he's going to have the ball in his hands probably less than Jaylen Brown would have. But he's also a better three-point shooter than Jaylen. And he's also a better defender, I would say, than Jaylen Brown, and a better passer. So maybe the Celtics were weighing those here when looking at this trade. Ultimately, like I said, Jaylen Brown's 29 years old, and he's coming off the best season of his career, so I understand why Celtics fans are upset. But I do think Paul George is still a good player. And like I've mentioned, I've been a big Paul George fan his whole career. Maybe this is the trade that gets me back to being more of a Celtics fan than I've been in recent years, because the Clippers are still my number 1 team, but maybe the Celtics will be my secondary team again down the line. We'll see. There are a lot of teams I like watching. I'm really excited about the Utah Jazz's future. I'm really excited to see what the Atlanta Hawks look like next year. They have some moves they still have to make. Maybe they try to get a new contract with Jonathan Kuminga, a guy I'm very high on. I'd love to see him be on the Clippers, but I'm not sure if that ends up being the case. But I think he has a lot of unlocked potential and untapped potential. But as I said, maybe this move here, getting Paul George, will make me be more of a Celtics fan this upcoming season, and I'll be more locked in with them than I was in the last few years. But no matter what, like I've said, even with the Clippers being in a rebuild era or a retooling era, I'm still sticking with them. They're still my 1A, but I'm a big Paul George fan, so I'm wishing him all the best. And something I want to add in when I was talking about the on-off stat and then also net rating with Jaylen Brown on the court versus with Jaylen Brown off of the court for the Celtics, neither one of those stats, I don't think, really accounts for garbage time minutes. So when the Celtics are up by 20 or down by 20 and Jaylen Brown's on the bench. So at the end of the day, some of those stats can be skewed that way. And also the Celtics have had a really deep bench in recent years and a lot of talent around Jaylen Brown and Jayson Tatum. So that may be another reason the on-off stat for Jaylen Brown had him having a negative rating in comparison to what a lot of people would presume would have been a positive one with him on the court versus a negative with him off the court. Obviously, that was the reverse with that stat. I think it's just because of how deep the Celtics bench has been. I don't think that should take away, though, from Jaylen Brown's impact and his talent. But I do think some of these statistics maybe the Celtics were looking at when they decide to move him. But I do want to note, I don't think either one of those stats, on, off, and then also net rating, I don't think either one really accounts for garbage time. So just want to mention that because there were times that Jaylen Brown was probably on the bench when the Celtics were up by 20, and then the bench players went in and outscored the other team by another 15 points and won the game by 35. With that being said, things always even out over time. But I'm sure at the end of the day, that stat can be skewed and interpreted in a different way, considering garbage time isn't included in that. So now for my final grades here on this trade, I would give Philadelphia an A- because to trade Paul George, no matter what, whether it was this trade or another one, they would have had to attach a first-round pick to his contract to move it. And not only were they able to add a first-round pick to his contract and trade him, they only had to add one more first and then 2 second-round picks in order to move it and land Jaylen Brown. At the end of the day, I think these picks could end up being premium picks, so that's why we'll have to see how things play out. But even if they are or they aren't, I don't think Jaylen Brown is a great fit in Philly next to Maxey and Embiid because they're going to be primary options on offense. and steal some possessions away from Jaylen. However, it's worth the roll of the dice for Philly because they got off of Paul George's contract and also got a 29-year-old player who's coming off the best year of his career. But now they're going to have to pay Jaylen Brown at some point heavy money to extend him unless they decide to flip him again down the line. We'll see how things work out. I'm wishing Jaylen Brown all of the best. I met him once when he was practicing at BC last summer, and he was so nice, such a down-to-earth guy. I hope he does great things in Philadelphia. I'm going to give the Celtics a C+, but a B- if they flip these two picks. I know that's not as harsh as most people would grade them, but they should have received, I think, a young, rising player in return and should have probably waited until they got an offer that included a young player like VJ Edgecombe, Shaedon Sharpe, or Alperen Sengun. As I noted, the 2 first-round picks they got in this deal could end up being premium picks that the Celtics could flip for more talent that could help them right now. Or maybe the Celtics see this year coming up as another gap year and are waiting until next year to flip Paul George's contract when it's an expiring contract after he presumably opts into the final year of that deal. And then also maybe they wait and see what the landscape of the NBA looks like next year. Maybe Nikola Jokic gets upset in Denver down the line and the Celtics want to trade for him. That's just kind of throwing out a random thought. But you never know. Maybe the Celtics are looking a little bit ahead with these picks. As I've mentioned now multiple times, I still think Paul George is a good player and can be a strong complementary piece if healthy next to Jayson Tatum. I think the Celtics can still win this trade, even though I know a lot of people would disagree with me, and I understand that. But if they were to flip these 2 first-round picks they got for somebody to help them right now, I think they could win this trade. But we're going to have to see how things play out. A lineup with potentially getting Trey Murphy III, and then also with Paul George, both of those guys are 2 good complementary pieces next to Jayson Tatum. They could be better additions to the lineup than having just Jaylen Brown. If you have Trey Murphy III and Paul George, maybe the Celtics lineup would be better, and I honestly think it might be in that case. Regardless, a 29-year-old who's coming off a career year and is still on a contract for 3 more years should have netted a stronger return, but maybe that was the best return that the Celtics had from the trade market. No one really knows at the end of the day, but in that case, maybe the Celtics should have waited until further into the summer to wait and see how things play out before making this move. But maybe other teams looked at some of these statistics, the on-off statistic I've mentioned, the net rating with Brown off the floor versus on the floor. Also may have looked at the turnover percentages and maybe the true shooting percentages. Maybe people looked at those advanced metrics and front offices got worried about trading a young star for a JB. We'll see how things play out at the end of the day. But I'm going to go B- for the Celtics. I think this trade offers them financial flexibility that maybe the Celtics were looking for. They probably didn't want to give him, it seems, that 2-year, $145 million extension that he was up for. And now in return, they get off the books a little bit sooner, considering if the Celtics gave Brown that 2-year extension, he would have 5 years left on his deal, and Paul George presumably will have 2 years left on his deal because people expect him to opt into his player option for next summer. So this trade does offer some financial flexibility, and I do think Paul George is still a good complementary piece, but I do obviously acknowledge his best basketball days are likely behind him. He's 36 years old and has had injury issues in the past, so I understand Celtics fans' concern there. But if he is healthy, I think Paul George is still a good player. I know a lot of people are saying he's completely washed and this is a horrible trade, and I understand why Celtics fans are upset. But like I noted, I don't think Paul George is a 40-year-old Vince Carter at this point. He's still a good player, and he can still play, and he showcased his three-point shot-making ability in the playoffs this past year for Philly. So we'll see how things play out in this trade. Jaylen Brown, I do think, definitely felt disrespected over the last few years by the Celtics. They were constantly shopping him for big-time stars. The fan base even was against him at one point after a tough NBA Finals run in 2022 when they lost to the Warriors. Jaylen Brown had some tough turnovers in that playoff stretch there for the Celtics in 2022, and fans were upset with him then. So I do think at the end of the day, he might have felt disrespected, especially from the Celtics front office and the way they went about things right now. He did win a Finals MVP here, and a lot of people questioned whether or not Jayson Tatum should have won over him. A lot of people thought it was a close race there for who was going to win Finals MVP, which that debate takes some of the credit and spotlight away from Jaylen Brown, who had a very good Finals run there for the Celtics when they beat Dallas in 2024. Add in the fact that Derek White, Jayson Tatum, and Drew Holiday were all on Team USA. that summer to play on the USA Olympic basketball team, and Jaylen Brown wasn't on that team, which that's not the Celtics' fault at the end of the day, but Brown was always being compared to Jayson Tatum. He's seen as the second option, which is why I think a new beginning may be best for him. Even though in Philly, he's still going to have to give up shots and give up some looks to Joel Embiid if healthy, and also Tyrese Maxey. But maybe it was just the best time for both the Celtics and Jaylen Brown to go their separate ways. Regardless, Jaylen Brown is always going to be a Celtics legend. Celtics fans are always going to appreciate what he did on the court and off the court for the city of Boston. He gave back to the community a lot and was definitely a figure that a lot of kids around here looked up to. So I'm wishing Jaylen Brown all of the best in Philadelphia. I'm excited to see what he does there in Philly. I'm excited to see what Paul George does here in Boston. Like I've noted, I've been a big Paul George fan for years. So to see him play more now in person is something that will be very special and something I'm looking forward to this upcoming season. Anyways, that'll wrap up this episode. Thank you guys so much for taking the time to listen to this. As always, I appreciate it. I hope you guys have a great one. Enjoy the 4th of July, and I will see you guys in the next episode. Thank you, and take care.